There's a thing nobody tells you about the high plains in winter. The snow doesn't fall so much as it arrives, sideways and personal, like it has a grudge and knows your name. I've ranched this stretch of nothing for 31 years. I've buried 4 dogs, 2 horses, 1 brother, and more cattle than I care to count. I thought I'd seen every way this country could kill a man. I was wrong, and the man who proved me wrong had been living in a hole in the ground for the better part of a year. Not 40 feet from a fence line I rode past every single morning without ever once looking down. His name was Elias Prout. The county had him listed as deceased, had him listed that way for 11 months before that blizzard came through and rearranged who got to keep breathing. I'm going to tell you how a man with nothing made a home out of an abandoned dry well. I'm going to tell you what I found when the storm of the century finally broke and I went out counting the dead. But before any of that, I need you to understand one thing, because it's the only part that's kept me up nights since. Of every soul caught out in that blizzard, the experienced ranchers, the search teams, the folks who knew this land their whole lives, the only one who lived was the one everybody had already written off. The dead man in the hole. I want to start with the morning I almost rode right past him, because that's the part I can't forgive myself for. And I've found that the things you can't forgive sit in you straighter than the things you can. It was a Tuesday in late October. I remember because I keep a logbook, always have, a habit my father beat into me, though he'd have used a gentler word. Date, weather, cattle count, anything broke, anything fixed. My wife Marlene used to say I'd write down the exact minute the world ended if I had a pencil handy. She wasn't entirely wrong. There's a comfort in turning a wild day into a few flat lines on paper. Makes you feel like you had a hand in it. So Tuesday, late October. The entry I wrote that morning says cold snap coming, west fence sagging, found nothing. That last part was a lie, I just didn't know it yet. The west fence runs along the old Hadley parcel, a square mile of busted ground the bank took back in the 80s and nobody ever wanted after. There's a well out there. There are wells all over this country, dry ones mostly, hand-dug 100 years ago by men who hoped harder than The Hangul. Ko sungdi good enus, hangul ko enus, hangul kong enus, ground rewarded. Most got capped. A few got forgotten. The Hadley well was one of the forgotten ones. Just a dark mouth in the dirt ringed by a low collar of fieldstone, half swallowed by sagebrush. I'd ridden past it 10,000 times. That morning my mare, Dolly, balked. Just stopped, ears up, doing that little sidestep she does when there's a rattler or a coyote den, or, one memorable time, a hot air balloon drifting low over the ridge. I cussed at her. I was cold and behind and not in a charitable mood. But Dolly's never been wrong about the land, not once in 9 years, so I followed her stare. There was smoke. Thin, almost nothing, a gray thread rising up out of the ground itself like the earth was exhaling. It came from the well. Now I'll be honest about the next few seconds because I've thought about them a lot. My first feeling wasn't concern. It was irritation. Squatters, I figured. Some drifter making a campfire in a hole, going to burn off half the parcel and leave me to deal with the BLM and the insurance and a week of paperwork. I got down off Dolly with my jaw set, ready to run somebody off my land. I leaned over the stone collar and looked down. I have looked down a lot of holes in my life. Holes are where dead things go on a ranch, fallen calves, dropped tools, the occasional unlucky barn cat. You learn to look down a hole and brace for something sad. What I was not braced for was a face looking back up at me. A man's face, pale as a fish belly in the dark, maybe 20 feet down, lit orange from below by a little stove I couldn't see. He had a beard down to his chest and eyes so wide and still that for one full second I genuinely believed I was looking at a ghost, and I am not a man given to ghosts. "Mornin'," he said. Just that, mornin', polite as a church usher, like I'd knocked on his door instead of stumbled onto the fact that he was living in a grave. I won't repeat what I said back. It wasn't dignified. His name was Elias, and getting it out of him took the better part of an hour, most of which I spent on my knees in the cold dirt shouting questions down a hole while he answered in a voice that came up muffled and warped, like talking to somebody at the bottom of the sea. He wouldn't come up. That was the first strange thing. I told him to climb out. There was a rope ladder, I could see it, fixed to an iron spike driven into the stone, and he just shook his head slow and said he was fine where he was, thank you, and was there anything he could do for me? Anything he could do for me. The man was living in a dry well, and he was worried about being a bother. I should explain what I could see, because the more I looked, the more my whole idea of the situation came apart in my hands. This wasn't a campsite. This wasn't a drifter passing through. The well had been worked. The walls, which would have been raw stone and crumbling dirt, had been shored up with timber, old fence posts, I realized later, the ones that had been disappearing off the Hadley line for months that I'd blamed on rot and wind. There were shelves cut into the earth, a bedroll. A little iron stove vented up through a pipe. That was my smoke, with the exhaust angled out a crack in the stone collar so cunningly that I'd never once smelled it riding by. Jars of something on the shelves. A lantern. A stack of what looked like books, though that didn't make any sense to me then. He'd been down there a long time. You don't build a thing like that in a week. How long? I asked him. There was a pause. The stove ticked. What's the date? He said. I told him. Another pause longer. I heard him breathe. Then he said, very quiet, more to himself than to me, 11 months. 11 months. He'd been living in the ground under my nose, 40 feet off a fence line I inspected every morning, for nearly a year, and I had ridden past with my collar up in my mind on cattle prices and never once looked down. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that the worst thing I did in this whole story wasn't anything I did on purpose. It was all the mornings I didn't look. The plain, ordinary blindness of a busy man. I think about that more than I think about the blizzard, and the blizzard is the part that should keep me up. Here is what I learned in pieces over that first day and the days after, sitting up top while he stayed below, the two of us talking through 20 feet of cold air like the world's strangest confessional. Elias Prout had been a hand on the old Macready spread, 2 valleys over, for 19 years. He'd had a wife, Ruth, and a daughter, and a small house the Macreadys let him keep as part of his wages. He wasn't a wealthy man. He wasn't even, by his own telling, a particularly remarkable one. He was good with stock and quiet at supper, and he fixed what broke, and that was the shape of his life, and he'd been content in it. Then 2 years back, 3 things happened close together the way bad things do, like they're conspiring. Old man Macready died, and his son sold the spread to a corporation out of Denver that ran it from a laptop, and had no use for a 51-year-old ranch hand and his family in a house they wanted to bulldoze for a hospitality venture. That was the first thing. The second thing was Ruth's cancer, which had been quiet and then very suddenly was not, and which ate through what little savings they had and then kept eating after the money was gone. The third thing, and this is the one where his voice changed, down in that hole, this is the one where the warped underwater sound of him went flat and careful. The third thing was that Ruth died in the county hospital in March, and his daughter, grown now and married and living in Portland with a husband Elias had never warmed to, came out for the funeral and then went home. And somewhere in the awful arithmetic of grief and money, and a man who'd lost his house and his job and his wife all in the same season, Elias Prout simply stepped out of the world. He didn't decide to disappear, he told me. He just stopped having any reason to be found. There's a difference, and I've turned it over a lot. He stopped going to town, stopped cashing the last of his checks. The corporation reported the homestead abandoned. There was, apparently, some confusion with another Prout, an old fellow who passed in a care home that same month, and a clerk somewhere matched the wrong file to the wrong man. And that is how Elias came to be listed deceased by the county of which he was, demonstrably, still a living resident, just one residing 20 feet underground. Nobody came looking, I asked him. The stove ticked. Who'd be left to look, he said, not a question. He didn't say it bitter. That was the thing that got me. A bitter man I'd have understood. He said it the way you'd report the weather. I tried, those first days, to do the things a decent person is supposed to do. I told him I'd call the county, get the death record fixed, get him into the system, get him help, that word help, which I tossed down that hole like it was a rope and watched it do absolutely nothing. I appreciate it, he'd say. I'm all right where I am. I told him winter was coming and he could not, spend it in a hole in the ground. He told me he'd already spent one down there and showed me, holding the lantern up so I could see, how he'd survived it, the timber shoring, the stove, the way the earth itself held a steady cold that never dropped to the killing temperatures up top, the cistern he'd dug into the side where snowmelt collected. The stores of dried meat and roots, and the jars I now saw were full of put-up vegetables he'd grown in a little hidden patch on the sunny south slope of the Hadley parcel, where the soil was just good enough. He had, I came to understand, built a working homestead. He just built it down instead of out. It was the most resourceful thing I had ever seen a human being do, and it was breaking my heart in real time, and I did not have the first idea what to do about either of those facts. I started bringing him things. Coffee, because he hadn't had real coffee in months, and the first time I lowered a thermos down on a string I heard him make a sound, just a breath, just a small O that I will hear on my deathbed. Newspapers, which he read by lantern light and then used to chink the gaps in his timber. A side of bacon. A radio, which he wouldn't take at first and then did, and which I'd hear sometimes drifting up out of the ground when I rode by at dusk. A tinny voice or a fiddle tune rising up out of the earth like the land was haunted by ordinary life. I did not tell anybody. I want to be honest about that too. I had a dozen good reasons he asked me not to. He was a grown man, it was his choice. Who was I to drag him up into a world that had so thoroughly demonstrated it didn't want him? All of those reasons were true. And underneath them, smaller and uglier and just as true, was this. Some part of me liked it, liked having him out there. Liked the morning ride that now had a purpose, the thermos on its string, the strange grave company of a man who asked nothing and gave back this odd piece I can't fully explain. Marlene's been gone 6 years. The house is quiet. A man gets to where a voice coming up out of the ground feels like more company than the whole town of living people who never call. So I kept his secret. For him, I told myself, mostly for him. That's a thing I have to carry. He told me one evening. It was getting on toward the middle of November, the light going copper and quick the way it does before the real cold, about his wife. I hadn't asked. He just started talking, the way the dark down there seemed to loosen something in him that daylight kept clamped. He told me Ruth used to sing while she cooked. Off-key, always the same 6 or 7 songs, hymns mostly, and 1 or 2 she'd half remembered from the radio of her own girlhood. He told me he never once told her she was off-key because she'd have stopped, and the off-key singing was the sound of his whole adult life, the sound of being a married man in a warm kitchen, and he'd have rather listened to her murder a tune for 50 years than ever hear the house go silent. Then the house had gone silent, and then there hadn't been a house. Down here, he said, I can still hear it. That's the thing nobody'd understand. Up top in a new place with new sounds I tried for a while after. Slept in the truck, slept in a shelter in town 1 week. Couldn't hear her at all. Too much noise, other people's noise. The lantern shifted. Down here it's quiet enough I can still hear her sing, so this is where I stay. I didn't have anything to say to that. I'm not a man with words for such things. I just sat on the cold stone collar in the failing light with my hand resting flat on the dirt, like you'd rest a hand on a coffin, except the man inside was alive, and the dead one was the world up top, and we stayed like that a while as the dark came down. When I rode home that night, the first real snow was starting. Not the killing snow. Not yet. Just the gentle front edge of it, the kind that makes you think winter might be a soft thing this year. It would not be a soft thing this year. I want to end this first part on the last ordinary day, because everything after it stops being ordinary, and I think the ordinary days deserve their own ending. It was the 20th of November. I know because of the logbook. The entry reads, "First hard snow forecast Friday. E has wood and stores. Brought matches, salt, batteries." He asked after Dolly's hoof. Good man. I'd taken to writing about him in there, you understand. Coded just E in case anybody ever read it, which nobody ever does, but old habits. He'd become a regular line in the record of my days, the dead man, the man in the well, E, good man. That afternoon I climbed down. First time. He'd finally allowed it, and it felt like a thing being given rather than a thing I took. 20 feet down a rope ladder into the warm orange dark, into the smell of wood smoke and earth and coffee, and the close clean smell of a place a careful man keeps. And I sat on an upturned crate across from him, and we drank coffee, and he showed me his books, feed store paperbacks. A Bible, a water-swollen field guide to birds that had been Ruth's. And I saw, on the shelf in a tin, a photograph. A woman with her head thrown back, mid-laugh, flower on her hands. He saw me looking, and he didn't reach to hide it the way some men would. He just looked at it with me for a second. Then he said, "She'd have liked you. You don't talk too much." I laughed. It came out rougher than I meant. We sat down there as the temperature dropped up top, two old men in a hole in the ground. And for that 1 hour it was the warmest place in the whole wide cold country. And neither of us knew that in 5 days the sky was going to fall on this land harder than it had fallen in 80 years, and that everyone caught above ground and it would die. And the only living soul for 20 miles would be the one the county had already buried on paper, the one nobody came looking for. The one who'd built a warm home in a grave, because it was the only place left on earth he could still hear his wife singing. I climbed back up into the cold and the early dark. The snow had stopped for the moment. I told him I'd see him Friday. I wanted on the record that I believed that. I wanted on the record that when I said "see you Friday" and rode home, I had no idea I was telling the truth in a way that would cost so much. The forecast said Friday. The forecast was wrong by 16 hours, and 16 hours is the difference between a man getting his stock in and a man not, between a family making it to town and a family stalling out on the county road with the heater running, and the snow climbing the windows like water filling a sinking boat. It came Thursday night. I was at the kitchen table when it started, doing the books, the radio on low. The wind had been picking up since supper, nothing alarming, just the usual prairie complaint, the house ticking and settling the way it does. Then around 9 the power flickered, steadied, flickered again, and the radio voice changed. You know how a voice changes. The fellow had been reading hog futures and the high school basketball scores, all that flat reassuring nothing, and then mid-sentence he stopped, and there was a half-second of dead air, and when he came back his voice had weight in it. Emergency message. The National Weather Service has upgraded. Those were the words, upgraded. I have hated that word ever since. I went to the window. I couldn't see the barn. The barn is 90 feet from my kitchen window, and it might as well have been on the moon. The world had turned to static, white static, screaming sideways past the glass under the porch light, and the temperature. I checked the thermometer nailed to the post, and then checked it again because I didn't believe it had fallen 19 degrees since I'd sat down to the books. 19 degrees in an evening. The wind was a thing alive by then, throwing itself at the house in long shuddering runs that made the rafters groan, and under it, threaded through it, was a sound I'd only heard twice before in my life. A low continuous howl that isn't the wind exactly but the land. The whole flat empty country picking up the wind and singing it back. A sound with no edges and no end. The sound of a place with nothing on it to break a storm, and so the storm just runs and runs. My first thought, my first, immediate gut-level thought, before the cattle, before anything, was Elia's. And my second thought, hard on its heels, was the strangest small flood of relief I have ever felt in my life. He's underground. 20 feet of solid earth between him and that sky. The one man I knew out in all this nothing was the one man it couldn't reach. I stood at my black window with the house shaking around me, and I thought, he's the safest soul in the county tonight. And God help me, it loosened something in my chest. And I want you to remember that I felt that, because in a few hours I was going to be the only other living thing for 20 miles, and I did not yet know it, and I went to bed. I didn't sleep much. You don't in a storm like that. The house fought all night. Toward 4 in the morning, I heard a tremendous crack and a crash, and in the gray half-light I'd find later that the big cottonwood by the corral, a tree older than my father, had come down across the loafing shed and killed 2 heifers outright, and I'd hardly hear it for the wind, and I'd grieve those animals less than I have ever grieved animals, because by then I'd have so much worse to grieve. By dawn, if you could call it dawn, this dim brown nothing that the day became, the snow had stopped falling and started traveling. That's worse. That's so much worse. The storm had dumped its load, and now the wind had it, lifting it off the ground and driving it in solid horizontal sheets, a ground blizzard, the kind where the sky can be clear blue overhead and you still can't see your own hand because the whole bottom 10 feet of the world is moving snow. The thermometer read 31 below. With the wind, it was a number that doesn't mean anything. A number the body simply cannot argue with. My phone had no signal. The landline was dead, lines down, I figured, all over the grid. The radio still worked, and the radio was how I learned, over the next terrible day, what the storm was doing to everyone who hadn't been lucky enough to live in a hole in the ground. Let me tell you who died, because the title of this thing promises you a blizzard that saved no one else, and I will not make you take that on faith. Vandermeer family, Pete and his wife and their 2 boys, left their place Thursday evening for town, ahead of the Friday forecast, trying to beat a storm that beat them instead. They made it 4 miles. The county found the truck Sunday, drifted to the door handles, all 4 of them inside. Pete had run the engine until the fuel was gone, and then, the coroner figured, had given his coat to the younger boy and his shirt to the older one. They found him in his undershirt with both arms around them. I'd known Pete Vandermeer since we were boys ourselves. He was a loud, foolish, generous man who'd once driven 40 miles in the rain to lend me a part I hadn't even asked for. Endurance, the title cards of this country might say. Sacrifice. I just say Pete and I have to stop a minute. Old Holly's Brant, 83, who would not leave his stock and went out to the barn Friday morning and got turned around in the ground blizzard between the barn and the house, a distance of maybe 60 feet, a distance he'd walked 10,000 times in the dark, and was found leaning against his own fence, 40 feet from his own back door, frozen standing up. 60 feet. The land doesn't care how long you've lived on it. It will kill you in your own backyard with your house lights burning. And the search team. This is the one. This is the one the radio gave me in pieces over Saturday and Sunday, and that I have never gotten over. When the Vandermeers were reported missing, a relative in town who couldn't raise them, the county sent out a team. Volunteers, mostly. Men I knew. Men who knew this land as well as any living souls, who'd grown up on it, who understood exactly how it could kill and went out into it anyway, because that is what you do here when your neighbors are missing. Their vehicle stalled. They tried to walk to a ranch they knew was near. The ground blizzard took the near ranch and hid it from them in a wall of moving white, and they walked the wrong way, all of them together, roped together so as not to be separated. And being roped together meant that when the cold took them, it took them as a group, and they were found in a line in a field, 4 men who had gone out to save lives, holding the same rope. Collective action, sacrifice. The country eats its best people first. It eats the ones who go out. The ones who stay home survive, and they have to live the rest of their lives knowing they stayed home. I stayed home. I want that on the record too. I sat in my shaking house for 3 days, and I survived because I had a stocked pantry and a propane heater, and the simple animal luck of not having to be anywhere. And meanwhile, within 20 miles of my kitchen table, The best men I knew walked into the white and did not walk out. And the only living person besides me in all that killed country was a man the county had declared dead in March, sitting warm in a grave he dug himself, listening to his wife sing. I'll tell you about the worst night, my own worst night, which doesn't compare to the dying but which I have to tell you because it's where the heart of this turns. It was Saturday. The wind had eased just enough by evening to drop the world from impossible to merely deadly, and I could see, in the porch light, maybe 30 feet, and I got it into my head that I had to get to Elia's. It made no sense. He was, I knew, the safest creature alive. He had stores, heat, water, 20 feet of earth. He needed nothing. I needed something, I see that now. I needed to not be the only living person I knew. I needed to put my hand on a hole in the ground and hear a voice come up out of it and know that the whole world hadn't ended, that somewhere in all this white murder there was still one warm room with a man in it who was glad of my coming. The radio had been reading me the names of the dead all day. I could not sit one more hour in that house with the radio reading me the names. So I did the most foolish thing I have done in 31 years on this land. I saddled Dolly, couldn't take the truck. The drifts were over the hood in the lane, and I rode out into a ground blizzard at 30 below toward a fence line a mile and a half away that I could not see, and had no business trusting myself to find. I want to be clear that this was exactly the mistake that killed the search team. Exactly. A man who knows the land deciding the land will make an exception for him. The land does not make exceptions. The only reason I am here to write this is Dolly, who is a better animal than I am a man, and who put her head down and walked into that wind with a kind of grim refusal that I have never deserved from any creature. I don't remember most of the ride. That frightens me looking back, the way the cold gets into your thinking and rounds off the edges of it, makes everything feel slow and reasonable and warm right before it kills you. I remember the fence wire singing. I remember losing all feeling in my face and then, worse, not minding. I remember thinking with a calm that should have terrified me that I would just rest a minute, just let Dolly stop a minute, and how good a minute's rest would feel. Dolly did not stop. Dolly walked us somehow by some grace in her that I can't account for, straight to the stone collar of the Hadley well, and she stopped there, and the stopping is what woke me, and I fell off her more than dismounted and crawled the last few feet on my hands and knees through snow up to my elbows, and I got my head over the collar, and I could not feel my own mouth enough to call down. But there was light, faint orange 20 feet down, and there was, threading up out of the earth under the howl of the wind, so quiet I might have dreamed it. Singing. Off-key the same 6 or 7 songs. He was singing her songs. Down there in the dark, alone, in the middle of the storm that was killing everyone above the ground, Elias Prout was singing his dead wife's hymns to the timber walls, badly, the way she had, keeping her voice alive the only way left to him, and the sound of it coming up out of that grave is the closest thing to holy I have ever encountered, and I have been inside churches. I made some sound, I don't know what. It wasn't a word, I couldn't make words. The singing stopped. A silence and then his voice, sharp with alarm in a way I'd never heard from him. Who's there? I got out one syllable, my name half of it. And then I heard him move, heard the scramble of him, the rope ladder. A man past 50 who I'd never once seen leave that hole coming up out of it faster than I'd have thought possible. And his hands, his bare warm hands closing on my frozen coat and his voice right at my ear now, the underwater warp of it gone, just a man, just a frightened, furious, tender man saying, "You damned fool, you damned fool. Come down out of it, come down." He got me down that ladder. I will never understand how. A man 20 feet underground hauled another man down into the earth to save his life, which is backwards from every story this country tells about itself, where salvation is always up and out and toward the light. Mine came down. Mine came down into a grave that turned out to be the warmest, safest, most alive place in 200 square miles of beautiful murdering snow. I came back to myself slow, by the stove, wrapped in his bedroll and his blankets, in, I'd realize his own coat. He'd given me his coat. Same as Pete Vandermeer in that frozen truck 4 miles away, except Pete had no warm room to give it in and I did. And so the same act that killed my friend only embarrassed me. And that is the whole cruel lottery of that storm in two facts side by side. Elias sat across from me on the upturned crate, feeding the stove, watching me with those wide still eyes, and when he was sure I'd live he did a thing I didn't expect. He got angry. Not loud, Elias was never loud, but his hands shook on the stove door and his jaw worked and finally he said, "Lo, you could have died for what? To check on a dead man, to make sure the grave was comfortable." He laughed and it was an awful laugh, nothing like a laugh. 11 months nobody came looking and now a man rides into a killing storm to look in on a hole. You should have stayed home. You should have stayed home, you hear me. I'm not worth the ride. I'm a thing the county already crossed off. You don't risk a life for a thing that's already been crossed off. And there it was. There was the whole of it, the wound under the resourcefulness, the reason a man builds a home in a grave and won't come up. It wasn't peace down there. I'd let myself believe it was peace because it was easier and because I liked the company. It wasn't peace. It was a man who had decided in the worst season of his life that he was a thing already crossed off, a thing not worth coming up for, a thing the world had filed under deceased, and a thing that, somewhere quiet and terrible in himself, agreed with the filing. I was too cold and too wrung out to be wise. I didn't have a speech. I'm not a man with speeches, and anyway speeches would have bounced off him like that word help had bounced for a month. So I just said the only true thing I had. I didn't ride out for a dead man, I said. My voice came back to me in pieces. I rode out 'cause the radio's been reading me names all day, and yours wasn't on it, and I needed, and here I had to stop because my throat closed, the cold or the truth I couldn't tell you. I needed there to be one name that wasn't on it. I needed one, and it was yours. You're the only soul I know that storm didn't get. The only one, so don't you tell me you're crossed off. You're the last man standing. You're the only man standing, out of all of us. The stove ticked. He looked at me a long time. The lantern threw both our shadows huge and wavering up the timber walls, up the shored-up earth. Two old men's shadows trembling in the warm dark while the storm screamed itself out somewhere far above us, 20 feet up, in a world that had killed everyone else who'd been brave enough or foolish enough or simply unlucky enough to stay above the ground. And Elias Prout, the dead man, the man in the well, the man who couldn't come up, put his face in his hands, his warm living hands that had just pulled me out of the snow. And for the first time since Ruth died 8 months before, he wept. I let him. I didn't say a word. You don't for that. I just put one numb hand flat against the timber wall, the way I'd rested it on the cold collar 100 mornings, except now I was inside the thing, inside the grave on the living side of the dirt. And I kept it there while the man wept and the storm howled, and the little stove held the line against 31 below. And somewhere up in the screaming dark, the snow went on burying everyone we knew. We stayed down there 2 more days, the two of us, while the storm spent itself. He fed me. He fed Dolly, who he'd brought into the lee of the stone collar and blanketed and who lived. We did not talk much. We didn't need to. We drank coffee out of the same tin cup passed back and forth, and once, I'll never forget it, once he started, very quiet, almost not aware he was doing it, to sing one of Ruth's hymns again, off-key, and he caught himself and stopped and looked at me, embarrassed. The storm broke on a Monday. I remember the exact moment because the wind, which had been a constant for 4 days, a thing so steady you stopped hearing it the way you stop hearing your own blood, simply stopped. Mid-howl, like a hand closing a door, and into the silence it left came the small, ordinary sounds of the world clearing its throat, snow sliding off the stone collar, the stove ticking, Dolly shifting her weight, Elias slow breathing. We both went still and looked up the shaft at the circle of sky at the top, which had gone, for the first time in days, an impossible scalded blue. "That's it," he said. "That's the back of it." We climbed up. I want to describe what we saw because nothing I'd lived through underground had prepared me for it. The country had been erased. There's no other word. Every fence, every contour, every familiar landmark of a life I'd spent 31 years memorizing had been smoothed under a single unbroken sheet of white that ran from the bottom of my boots to the curve of the earth. And over all of it lay a silence so total it had a pressure to it, a weight on the ears. The sun was blinding. The sky was that scoured, indifferent blue. And it was beautiful, that's the obscenity of it. It was the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. This clean, killing white country under a perfect sky. And somewhere out under that beauty lay Pete Vandermeer in his undershirt and old Hollies frozen standing at his fence, and 4 good men holding the same rope. Elias stood beside me at the lip of his well, blinking in a light he hadn't stood in for I don't know how long, an old man squinting at a ruined heaven, and he didn't say anything and neither did I. There wasn't anything. We just stood there, 2 of us, on the surface of a world that had killed everyone else, and let the sun hurt our eyes. It took 11 days to dig the county out enough for the dead to be counted and gathered. I was part of some of that, once the roads opened and the National Guard came through with the big machines. I helped carry. I won't tell you about the carrying. Some things you do and then you fold up small and put away and you don't take them out for anybody, and the carrying is one of those for me. But I'll tell you the thing that matters to this story, which is what I decided about Elias, because that was the morally heavy thing, and I've made you a promise about honesty all the way through, and I'm not going to flinch from it at the end. Here was the situation. Elias Prout was, on paper, dead. The county had him buried. There was a death certificate, a closed file, a clerk's error 8 months old that nobody had any reason to question. And in the aftermath of that storm, 26 dead in our county alone, the worst loss of life since the 30s, there was relief money coming. State money, federal money, a flood of it, the kind of help that arrives too late for everyone it was meant for and that the living have to scramble to claim before it dries up. There were programs, housing assistance, hardship grants, things that could put a roof, a real roof, above the ground over a man who had nothing. But you had to be alive to claim them. To bring Elias back to life on paper meant walking him into the county building and standing him in front of the same machinery that had crossed him off, and saying, "Here is a man you declare dead, fix it." It meant forms and questions, and a story that didn't make sense. Where have you been for 11 months, Mr. Prout? And the answer to that question was living in a hole in the ground on land that isn't his, which is the kind of answer that brings other kinds of people with other kinds of forms. The kind who decide whether a man who has built a home in a grave and sung hymns to the dark for the better part of a year is fit to be left to his own devices, or whether he ought to be somewhere. Somewhere with locked doors and a number on his wrist, for his own good. I'd seen for his own good before. I'd seen what it did to my own brother in his last bad years. For his own good is the most dangerous phrase the living ever speak about each other. So that was the decision. Leave him dead, leave him to the well, to the warm dark, to the only place on earth he could still hear Ruth sing, and let him survive the way he'd survived, off the grid and off the books, a free man and a buried one. Or bring him back to life, into the light, into the help and the housing and the warmth of a real home, and risk that the same world which had crossed him off would decide, having found him, that it knew better than he did where a broken man belonged. Warmth and a roof with chains on it, or freedom and a grave with none. I lay awake on that for 3 nights. I'm not a wise man and I had no one to ask. Marlene would have known. Marlene always knew the human thing, but Marlene's been gone 6 years and the house is quiet, and I had to decide it alone, the way Elias had decided everything alone for 2 years, and maybe that's why I finally understood what to do. I didn't decide it. That was the answer. I didn't decide it. It wasn't mine to decide. I'd spent a month telling myself I was keeping his secret for him when half of it was for me, and a man who'll lie to himself like that has no business deciding another man's whole life from the comfort of his own certainty. So I asked him. I climbed down into the well on a gray afternoon in early December and I laid it all out, the way I've laid it out for you. the death record, the relief money, the roof it could buy, and the cost of it, the questions, the forms, the people who decide things for your own good. I laid out both roads honest, the warm chained road and the free buried one, and I told him I'd walk whichever one he chose and not say one word against it. And then I shut my mouth, which is the hardest thing a man can do once he started caring about an outcome. He was quiet a long time. The stove ticked. He turned the tin cup in his hands. "You know what I keep thinking about," he finally said. "Those men, the ones with the rope." I waited. "They went out," he said, "into it, knowing, because somebody might have needed them, and it killed everyone." He turned the cup. "And I sat down here in the warm and lived. I built myself a safe little hole, and I crawled in it and pulled the world shut over my head, and the storm came and took the brave ones and left the man who hid." He looked up at me, and his eyes were wet, but his voice was steady, steadier than I'd ever heard it. "That's not surviving. I've been calling it surviving for 8 months. It's not. It's just not dying. There's a difference. Ruth would know the word for it. I don't." "Elias." "She'd have hated this," he said, soft, and it cracked me clean in two. "She'd have hated this hole. She'd have come down that ladder and looked around and said, 'Eli Prout, what in the world?' and she'd have made me come up that same hour. I've known it the whole time. I've been hiding down here in her songs and pretending it's what she'd want, and it's the opposite of what she'd want, because she'd want me living, and you can't." His voice came back. "You can't live in a grave. No matter how warm you make it. No matter how good the singing is, it's still a grave. I've been dead since March. The county got that part right. They just got the cause wrong." The lantern burned. Somewhere up top a crow called, the first I'd heard since the storm, life creeping back over the white. "So which road?" I said, gentle. "I'll walk either." He set the cup down. He looked around the well at the timber he'd shored, the shelves he'd cut, the cistern, the stores, the whole impossible competent home he'd carved out of the earth with his 2 hands in the worst year of his life, this monument to a man's refusal to simply lie down and quit even when he decided he wanted to. He looked at it the way you'd look at something you'd loved that had outlived its use. The way you'd look at a good old dog you've made the appointment for. "The light," he said, "take me up into the light, and if they put chains on it," he almost smiled, "well, I outlived a blizzard in a hole in the ground. I expect I can outlive a few forms. I'd like to tell you it went easy. It didn't. Bringing a dead man back to life is, it turns out, harder than killing a live one. There were forms just as I'd feared and questions, and a young woman at the county whose whole face did a thing when Elias gave his name, and she pulled up a file that said deceased March. There was a doctor. There was, yes, a conversation about whether a man who'd lived underground for 11 months was competent. That word, that careful word. And there was a bad week where I genuinely feared they'd take him somewhere. And I sat in waiting rooms with my hat in my hands, feeling more helpless than I'd felt in the storm. But here is a thing about disaster that I learned that winter, and it's the only good thing I learned. It makes people kind. For a little while. The storm had emptied the county of so many that the ones left over had a tenderness to them, a stunned generosity, a sense that every living soul was suddenly precious past arguing. The story of Elias, the dead man who'd survived the blizzard that took 26 of the living, moved through the county like warmth through a cold room. A man at the church found him a place. A woman who'd lost her husband in that frozen truck on the county road, of all people, she spoke up for him at the county, said, "Let the man be. Hasn't this country lost enough? Why are we trying to lose one more?" The grant came through. The roof came through. By spring, Elias Prout was living in a small house on the edge of town, with a real bed and a real kitchen, and a death certificate amended to read what death certificates ought to read about a man still drawing breath, which is nothing at all. The first thing he did in that kitchen, the church woman told me this, I wasn't there, was sing. Off-key. The same 6 or 7 songs, but up in the light now with the windows open where anyone passing could hear. I went out to the Hadley well one more time, that spring alone. The snow was gone. The The grass was coming up green and reckless the way it does out here, like the land's trying to apologize. The well was just a well again, a dark mouth in the dirt ringed by fieldstone, the timber shoring already starting to go soft with damp now that no stove dried it, the shelves empty, the bedroll gone. A hole in the ground that a man had once made into a home and then, harder, had chosen to leave. I stood at the collar a while. Dolly cropped grass behind me, indifferent, a working animal with no patience for a man's sentiment. I'd brought the logbook, I don't know why, habit. I opened it to a clean page and I stood there over the hole with my pencil and I tried to write down what I felt and I couldn't find the lines for it, which has never happened to me before. Date weather that I can do. Found nothing that I can do. But there's no flat little line on paper, for I am standing over the grave a man crawled out of. And the man is up in town singing with the windows open, and 26 others are in the actual ground, and I cannot for the life of me make sense of which of us the storm meant to save. So I wrote what I could. I wrote, Hadley well spring, doing well in town. And then, because it was true and because there was no one to read it but me, I wrote one more line. The blizzard saved no one else. I think it saved him by killing the part of him that wanted to stay down there. I have stopped trying to understand it. Then I shut the book. I see Elias most weeks now. He's got color back in his face and some flesh on his bones and a part-time job at the feed store where he's the man who actually knows things, which the young fellows are slowly figuring out. He's not whole. I want to be honest about that because I've been honest the whole way and I'm not going to hand you a tidy ending now. He's not whole. There are days the church woman says he doesn't come out, days the dark gets back into him, and I expect there always will be. You don't dig your way out of a grave and come up clean. Some of the dirt stays in you, some of the dark. But he's up. He's on the living side of it. And every now and then on a good evening he'll have me to that little house and he'll cook. He's a fair hand at it. He learned from Ruth, and the windows will be open to the long gold prairie light. And at some point, without thinking, the way she used to, he'll start to sing. Off-key the same 6 or 7 songs. And I don't tell him he's off-key. I'd never tell him. Because the off-key singing is the sound of a man being alive in a warm kitchen. Which is the thing she'd have wanted. Which is the thing he buried himself rather than face and then, at the very end, found the courage to climb up toward. I sit at his table on those evenings, and I listen to a dead man sing his dead wife's hymns up in the light, and I think about the rope team in the field, and Pete in his undershirt, and old Hollies at his fence, all of them braver than this hiding man, all of them gone. I think about how the country eats its best people first, and how the ones hooray left have to make of it what they can. And I think the only thing I've ever come close to making of it is this. The storm didn't save Elias because he deserved it more than the rest. It didn't work like that. It didn't work like anything. It was just snow and wind and the dumb luck of 20 feet of dirt. But what he did after the snow, coming up out of the only safe place he had left, walking into the cold, uncertain world on purpose, choosing the light with chains on it over the warm and certain dark. That part wasn't luck. That part was the bravest thing I ever saw a man do, and I've seen men walk into a blizzard on a rope to save strangers. He'll start another song now. I can hear him drawing the breath for it. I'm not going to write down what I feel when he does. Some things you keep off the page. Some things you just sit with in the gold light, in the warm kitchen, on the living side of the dirt, while a man who should be dead sings badly with the windows open. And the whole county, for once, gets to hear him.